Emma Richardson had stopped counting the silent dinners. 40 years old, married for 6, and somewhere along the way the conversations had evaporated like steam from a forgotten cup of coffee. She taught American literature at Cedar Grove High, a small brick building on the edge of town where everyone knew everyone, where her students still called her Mrs. Richardson with a reverence that made her feel older than she was. Michael worked in sales, always on the phone, always chasing the next deal. His voice animated and warm when he spoke to clients, but flat and distant when he came home. Their house smelled of lavender candles she lit to fill the silence. The walls were painted a soft cream, the furniture carefully chosen from catalogs that promised comfort and elegance. Everything matched. Everything was in its place. But Emma couldn't remember the last time Michael had really looked at her, not past her or through her, but at her, the way he used to when they first met at a conference in Seattle. Back then, his eyes had followed her across the room. Back then, he'd written her name on napkins and left them in her coat pocket. The idea for Italy came on a Tuesday night in March. Michael had been scrolling through his phone during dinner, barely touching the chicken she'd roasted with rosemary and garlic, when he suddenly looked up and said, "We should go somewhere. Rome, maybe. Get away for a bit." Emma's fork had stopped midway to her mouth. She'd been suggesting trips for 2 years, each one met with excuses about work, about timing, about money. But now, here he was, offering it freely. She'd smiled, hopeful, foolish enough to believe that distance might bring them closer. She spent weeks preparing. She bought a navy blue dress with small white flowers, something she'd normally never spend money on, but she wanted to feel beautiful again, wanted to see herself reflected differently in his eyes. She researched restaurants, printed out maps of the Colosseum and the Vatican, tucked them into a folder labeled "Our Trip" in her careful handwriting. She even wrote him a letter, something she hadn't done since their first anniversary. Folding it carefully into an envelope she planned to give him on the plane. In it, she'd written about the life she still hoped they could build, about forgiveness for the distance between them, about choosing each other again. The night before their flight, Emma couldn't sleep. She lay beside Michael, listening to his steady breathing, watching the shadows from the streetlight outside move across the ceiling. His back was turned to her the way it always was now. She wanted to reach out, to touch his shoulder, to whisper that she was excited, that she missed him, that she hoped this trip would be the beginning of something new. But she didn't. She was afraid of the silence that might follow. The pink suitcase sat by the front door, packed and repacked 3 times. She'd folded her clothes with care, tucked in the new perfume she'd bought, a scent called Speranza, hope in Italian. She'd learned a few phrases from an app on her phone, practicing them quietly in the bathroom mirror. Buongiorno. Grazie. Ti amo. Michael had packed his bag the night before in 10 minutes, throwing in shirts and pants without looking, zipping it shut like he was closing a file at work. Emma made coffee at 5 in the morning, the house still dark and quiet. She poured it into the travel mugs they'd received as wedding gifts, the ones with their initials intertwined. She remembered thinking, as she handed Michael his cup, that maybe this was the reset they needed. Maybe Rome would remind them of who they'd been before the silence, before the distance, before she'd started sleeping on the very edge of the bed so she wouldn't accidentally touch him and feel him pull away. Portland International Airport was already crowded when they arrived, the early morning light streaming through the tall windows and catching the dust in the air. Emma held the boarding passes in her hand, 2 tickets to Rome with a layover in New York, printed on paper that felt too thin for something that represented so much hope. Michael walked slightly ahead of her, pulling his black roller bag with one hand, checking his phone with the other. She watched the back of his head, the way his hair was starting to gray at the temples, the tension in his shoulders that never seemed to leave anymore. They checked in without speaking. Emma tried to make small talk with the woman behind the counter, commenting on the weather, on how excited they were for the trip. But Michael just nodded, his eyes still on his phone screen, his thumb scrolling endlessly through something she couldn't see. The agent smiled at Emma with a knowing look, the kind that said she'd seen 1,000 tired couples pass through this airport, all of them hoping a change of location might fix what was breaking inside. They cleared security and found their gate. Michael chose a seat near the window, away from the crowd, and Emma sat beside him, her purse in her lap, the letter to him tucked safely in the inside pocket. She'd planned to give it to him once they were in the air, somewhere over the Atlantic, when they'd have nowhere to go but toward each other. She glanced at him, trying to read his expression, but his face was closed off, distant, like a door that had been locked from the inside. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice soft, almost apologetic for interrupting whatever world he'd disappeared into. "Yeah, fine, just tired." He didn't look at her when he answered. Emma nodded and pulled out a book from her bag, though she knew she wouldn't be able to focus. The words on the page blurred together, sentences about love and loss that felt too close to her own life. She read the same paragraph 3 times before giving up and just watching the people around them. Families with small children, young couples holding hands, an elderly man helping his wife with her coat. She wondered if any of them could see it, the cracks in her marriage that felt so obvious to her, so impossible to hide. "I'm going to the restroom," Michael said suddenly, standing up and grabbing his phone. "Okay, I'll watch your bag," Emma said, but he was already walking away, his stride quick and purposeful, like he couldn't get away fast enough. She waited. 5 minutes, then 10. She checked her watch, watched the gate slowly fill with passengers preparing to board. 15 minutes. She glanced at Michael's bag, still sitting beside her, then looked toward the direction of the restrooms, expecting to see him walking back. But he didn't come. 20 minutes. A knot began to form in her stomach, small at first, just a whisper of worry that she tried to push away. Maybe there was a line. Maybe he'd stopped to get coffee. She pulled out her phone and texted him. "Where are you? They're going to start boarding soon." The message showed as delivered, then read, but no response came. Emma stood up, her heart beginning to beat faster. She looked around the gate area, scanning faces, searching for his familiar frame, his gray temples, his blue jacket. Nothing. She walked to the restrooms, stood outside the men's room awkwardly, waiting, watching men come and go. None of them were Michael. She went to the nearby coffee shop, peered inside, walked to the windows overlooking the tarmac. Her breathing was becoming shallow, her hands starting to shake. She returned to the gate, her eyes drawn to the spot where they'd been sitting. Her pink suitcase was still there, standing upright, waiting patiently like a loyal dog. Michael's black bag was gone. Emma stared at the empty space where his luggage had been, her mind struggling to make sense of what her eyes were telling her. She called his number. It rang once, twice, then went to voicemail. She called again. Voicemail. Again. Voicemail. She sent another text. "Michael, please, where are you? I'm scared. Read." No reply. A gate agent's voice came over the speaker announcing that boarding would begin shortly. Emma barely heard it. She was turning in circles now, her vision tunneling, her chest tight. She walked to the customer service desk, tried to explain to the woman there that her husband was missing, that he'd left his wife but taken his bag, and the woman gave her that same pitying look, the one that said this wasn't the first time she'd seen someone abandoned at an airport. "Ma'am, can I help you with anything?" a flight attendant asked, approaching Emma with concern. Emma couldn't answer. She couldn't form words. She just stood there in the middle of the terminal, her phone clutched in her hand, her boarding pass crumpled in her fist, and let the first tears fall. Emma found herself sitting on a cold metal bench near gate 47, her pink suitcase standing beside her like a silent witness. 2 hours had passed since Michael disappeared. 2 hours of searching, of calling, of texting into a void that swallowed every word she sent. The airport moved around her in a blur of rolling luggage and hurried footsteps, announcements echoing from invisible speakers, but she felt completely still, frozen in a moment that refused to move forward. Her phone sat in her lap, the screen dark and accusing. She kept picking it up, checking for messages that weren't there, refreshing her email, looking at the last text she'd sent him that still showed as read but unanswered. The boarding for their flight had come and gone. She'd watched from her bench as passengers lined up, scanned their tickets, disappeared down the jetway. She'd watched the gate agent close the door. She'd watched the plane push back from the terminal, taxiing away toward the runway, carrying all those couples and families and solo travelers to Rome, while she sat here with a suitcase full of carefully folded dreams and a husband who'd vanished. She should call someone, her sister maybe, or her friend Patricia from work. But the thought of explaining this, of putting words to what was happening, felt impossible. What would she even say? "My husband left me at the airport." It sounded absurd. like the setup to a bad joke. She imagined their reactions, the shock and pity and inevitable questions she didn't have answers for. Why would he do this? Did you fight? Were there signs? And the worst question, the one she was already asking herself in the darkness behind her closed eyes, what did I do wrong? The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with a frequency that made her teeth ache. The airport smelled of coffee and cleaning solution and something else, something metallic and sharp that might have been her own fear. Emma's hands trembled as she unlocked her phone again, her thumb hovering over Michael's name in her contacts. She'd called him 17 times. She'd counted. Then her phone vibrated in her hand and her heart stopped. A text message from Michael. She stared at his name on the screen, afraid to open it, afraid of what words might be waiting inside. Her finger moved slowly, reluctantly, tapping the notification. The message expanded, and Emma read the words once, twice, 3 times, her brain struggling to process the meaning of each sentence like they were written in a language she'd never learned. I can't do this anymore. I can't keep pretending. I've been seeing someone else for almost a year now. I filed for divorce last week. I'm sorry for doing it this way, but I couldn't look at you and say these things. I couldn't watch you cry. I know that makes me a coward. You deserve better than this. You deserve better than me. Emma's vision blurred, the words swimming together on the screen. She blinked and tears fell hot on her cheeks, splashing onto the phone's glass surface, distorting the letters underneath. Almost a year. The phrase echoed in her mind, bouncing around inside her skull like a stone thrown into an empty well. Almost a year. While she'd been planning this trip, buying that dress, writing that letter, practicing Italian phrases in the bathroom mirror, he'd been with someone else. While she'd been hoping Rome would save them, he'd already filed papers to end them. The phone slipped from her hands and clattered onto the floor. Emma didn't pick it up. She just sat there, bent forward, her elbows on her knees, her face in her hands, trying to breathe through the crushing weight that had settled on her chest. She thought about the letter in her purse, the one she'd written with such foolish optimism, and wanted to laugh at how stupid she'd been, how blind, how desperate. Around her, life continued its indifferent march. A child dropped an ice cream cone and wailed. A couple argued about a missed connection. A businessman shouted into his phone about a delayed meeting. No one seemed to notice the woman falling apart on the bench by gate 47. The woman whose husband had just blown up her entire world via text message from somewhere in this very airport. Or maybe already in a car heading home. Or maybe in the arms of whoever she was. This woman he'd been seeing for almost a year while Emma slept beside him every night. Completely unaware. The phone screen had gone dark on the floor. Emma stared at it, at her own distorted reflection in the black glass, and barely recognized the woman looking back. She didn't know how long she'd been sitting there when she heard the voice. It came from somewhere above her, gentle and tentative, pulling her slowly back from the dark place she'd disappeared into. "Excuse me, are you okay?" Emma looked up, her eyes swollen and red, her face wet with tears she'd stopped bothering to wipe away. A man stood a few feet from her bench, keeping a respectful distance, his hands in the pockets of his navy blue pilot's uniform. He had kind eyes, she noticed. The sort of eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled, though he wasn't smiling now. He was looking at her with genuine concern, the way a person looks at a wounded bird they found on the sidewalk, wanting to help but uncertain how. "I'm sorry," Emma managed, her voice hoarse and broken. "I'm fine." "You dropped your phone," he said, bending down to pick it up, checking the screen before handing it back to her. "Doesn't look cracked. That's lucky." Emma took it from him, their fingers brushing briefly. She held the phone like it was something dangerous, something that might explode if she squeezed too hard. She wanted to throw it away, to smash it against the floor until the screen shattered into 1,000 pieces, each one carrying a fragment of Michael's message into oblivion. The man hesitated, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "I know it's not really my business," he said carefully, "but I've been walking past this gate for the last hour, and you've been sitting here alone the whole time, and you just look like maybe you could use someone to talk to. Or not talk to. Sometimes that helps too." Emma looked at him more closely. He was tall, probably late 30s, with dark hair starting to gray at the temples, and a face that suggested he'd seen his share of difficult moments. His pilot's uniform was crisp and professional, his name tag reading Captain D. Carter. There was something steady about him, something solid and real in a world that had just revealed itself to be built on lies. "My husband left me here," Emma heard herself say, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "We were supposed to fly to Rome together. I went to the bathroom, and when I came back, he was gone. He took his bag and left me here with mine, and then he sent me a text saying he's been cheating on me for a year and he wants a divorce." Daniel Carter's expression shifted from concern to something darker, a flash of anger that he quickly controlled. "Jesus," he said quietly. "I'm sorry. That's unforgivable. I wrote him a letter," Emma continued, unable to stop now that she'd started, the words pouring out like water from a broken dam. "I packed it in my purse to give him on the plane. I thought this trip was going to fix things. I thought maybe we just needed to get away, to remember why we fell in love. But he was already done. He'd been done for a year, and I didn't even know." Daniel sat down on the bench beside her, maintaining a careful distance, not invading her space. "Can I tell you something?" he asked. "That letter you wrote, keep it, because someday when you're past all this, you'll read it again, and you'll see that you're the kind of person who still believes in fixing things, in fighting for love. And that's not something to be ashamed of. That's something rare." Emma looked at him, really looked at him, and saw something in his eyes that she recognized. Pain, old and healed over, but still there, the kind of scar that never fully fades. "You sound like someone who knows," she said. "My fiancé left me 3 years ago," Daniel said, staring straight ahead at the empty gate across from them. "Ran off with my best friend. They're married now, living in California. It took me a long time to be able to say that without feeling like I was going to break apart." They sat in silence for a moment, two strangers connected by the specific geography of betrayal. An announcement overhead called for final boarding on a flight to Denver. Emma watched passengers gather their belongings and line up, families and couples and people traveling alone, all of them heading somewhere, all of them with destinations and purposes and lives that hadn't just exploded in the middle of an airport. "I need to get back," Daniel said eventually, standing up. "My next flight's in an hour. But listen." He pulled a pen from his pocket and grabbed a napkin from a nearby coffee stand, writing quickly before handing it to her. "That's my number. If you need to talk or if you just need someone to listen, you can call me. No pressure, no expectations. Just an offer from one person who's been through hell to another." Emma took the napkin, stared at the numbers written in neat blue ink. "Why would you do this?" she asked. "You don't even know me." Daniel smiled sadly. "Because when I was sitting where you are, broken and alone, someone did the same thing for me, and it mattered." Emma returned home in a taxi that smelled of artificial pine and cigarette smoke that had seeped into the upholstery over years of passengers. The driver had tried to make conversation, asking about her trip, commenting on the weather, but she'd stared out the window in silence until he gave up and turned on the radio. The pink suitcase sat in the trunk, still packed with clothes she'd never wear in Rome, still carrying that bottle of perfume called Hope in a language she'd never get to practice. The house looked different when the taxi pulled into the driveway. Same cream-colored siding, same black shutters, same maple tree in the front yard that they'd planted together 5 years ago. But it felt hostile now, like a place that had been pretending to be a home when it was really just a stage set. All facade and no foundation. Emma paid the driver with trembling hands, declined his offer to help with her bag, and stood on the front porch fumbling with keys that suddenly felt foreign in her fingers. Inside, the silence was absolute. It pressed against her eardrums, thick and suffocating. Michael's shoes were gone from by the door. His jacket was missing from the hook. Emma walked through the rooms like a ghost haunting her own life, noticing all the empty spaces where his things had been. Half the closet was bare. His electric razor was gone from the bathroom. The coffee mug he always used, the blue one with the chipped handle, was absent from the dish rack. He'd planned this. While she was researching restaurants in Trastevere, he'd been packing boxes and moving them somewhere else, to some other life that didn't include her. The bed still smelled like him. That was the worst part. Emma stood in the doorway of their bedroom, staring at the unmade sheets, the pillow that still held the impression of his head, and felt something crack open inside her chest. She couldn't sleep there. She physically could not make herself walk to that bed and lie down in that smell, in those sheets that had witnessed years of growing distance, of backs turned, of goodnight kisses that landed on air instead of lips. She took a blanket from the linen closet and made a nest on the couch in the living room. The cushions were firm and uncomfortable, the fabric rough against her cheek, but at least it didn't smell like him. At least it didn't carry memories of the intimacy that had slowly died while she wasn't looking. Like a plant she'd forgotten to water until it was too late to save. The first week was a blur of automated motions. Emma called the school and took an emergency leave, citing a family crisis. Her voice on the phone had sounded strange to her own ears, flat and mechanical, like someone reading lines from a script. Her principal had been understanding, had told her to take all the time she needed, had said something about how they'd cover her classes. Emma had thanked her and hung up without really hearing any of it. She stopped answering her phone. Patricia called 7 times. Her sister called 12. They left voicemails that piled up like unread mail, their voices concerned and increasingly worried. Emma deleted them without listening. What could she possibly say to them? How could she explain that her marriage had been a lie for a year, that she'd been sleeping next to a stranger, that she'd been so desperate to save something that was already dead? She'd written a love letter to a man who'd been counting down the days until he could escape. The house became smaller. Emma found herself spending hours in the kitchen, sitting on the floor with her back against the cabinets, staring at nothing. She'd get up to make coffee and then forget why she was standing by the machine. She'd open the refrigerator and close it again without taking anything out. Food lost all taste and texture. Everything was cardboard in her mouth, something to be endured rather than enjoyed. One night she found the letter. It had fallen out of her purse and slipped behind the couch cushion, the envelope slightly crumpled, but still sealed. Emma held it in her hands, this artifact from a version of herself that seemed impossibly naive now, impossibly stupid. She opened it slowly, unfolding the paper, reading her own handwriting that had been so careful, so full of hope. "Dear Michael," it began, "I know we've been distant lately. I know we've let the daily routines of life pull us apart. But I believe in us. I believe in the people we were when we first met, and I believe we can find our way back to each other. This trip is my way of saying, I choose you. I choose us. I'm willing to fight for what we have because I know, deep down, that it's worth fighting for." Emma read the whole letter, every optimistic word, every vulnerable confession, every promise to try harder, to be better, to love more completely. When she finished, she didn't cry. She'd run out of tears somewhere around day 3. Instead, she methodically tore the letter into small pieces, watching them fall like snow onto the hardwood floor. Then she tore those pieces into smaller pieces, and smaller still, until all that remained was confetti, tiny fragments of words that no longer meant anything. The napkin with Daniel's number was still stuck to the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like the state of Oregon. Emma looked at it every time she opened the door for water or orange juice or nothing at all. She'd memorized the numbers by now, could recite them in her sleep, but she hadn't called. What would she even say? 3 months passed like a slow-motion car accident, each day stretching out impossibly long, while somehow the weeks blurred together into an indistinct gray mass. Emma went back to work because staying home was killing her. Her students noticed something was different, whispered about it in the hallways. She'd lost weight, her clothes hanging loose on a frame that had forgotten how to be hungry. She'd stopped wearing makeup, stopped styling her hair. She taught The Great Gatsby like she was reading a grocery list. All the passion she used to bring to literature dried up and blown away. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday in June, delivered by a courier who made her sign for them. Emma had stared at her own signature on the receipt, wondering when her handwriting had become so shaky, so uncertain. She didn't open the envelope for 3 days. It sat on the kitchen counter like a small bomb, ticking away the hours until she'd finally have to face it. When she did open it, she read through the legal language with a strange detachment, as if these documents were about someone else's life, someone else's failed marriage. Michael wanted the house. Of course he did. He was offering her half its value, splitting their savings, dividing up years of shared life into columns of assets and debts. She signed the papers without reading them thoroughly. What did it matter? She didn't want to fight. She didn't want to drag this out. She just wanted it to be over, to stop feeling like she was drowning in slow motion. Her lawyer, a woman named Janet with kind eyes and sensible shoes, had called her twice to discuss the settlement. But Emma had cut her short both times. Whatever he wants is fine. I just want to be done. That night, Emma couldn't sleep. It was late June. The air thick and humid. The kind of heat that made the house feel like it was pressing in on all sides. She'd tried lying on the couch with all the windows open, but sleep wouldn't come. Her mind kept circling back to the same questions. The same endless loop of what-ifs and how did I not seize. She got up around 11, paced through the dark house, her bare feet padding on the wood floors. The napkin was still on the refrigerator. 3 months old now, the edges curled from humidity, the ink slightly faded but still legible. Emma stood in the dim light from the microwave clock and stared at those numbers. Daniel Carter, captain, pilot, stranger who'd shown her more kindness in 15 minutes than her husband had shown her in the last year of their marriage. She picked up her phone before she could talk herself out of it. Her hands were shaking as she typed in the numbers, each digit a small act of courage or desperation. She wasn't sure which. Her thumb hovered over the call button. It was late. He probably wouldn't answer. He'd probably forgotten all about the crying woman in the airport, moved on with his life, his schedule, his flights to wherever pilots fly. Why would he remember her? Why would he care? She pressed call. The phone rang once, twice. Emma's heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. 3 times. She was about to hang up when the line clicked and she heard his voice, sleep-rough and confused. Hello? Emma opened her mouth, but no sound came out. What was she doing? This was insane. She should hang up. She should delete his number. She should... Hello? He said again. Is someone there? It's Emma. She managed, her voice barely above a whisper. From the airport. I'm sorry, I know it's late. I shouldn't have called, I just... Emma. His voice changed, became alert, concerned. No, it's okay. Are you all right? I don't know, she said honestly. I don't know if I'm all right or if I'm losing my mind or if this is what being all right feels like now. I signed divorce papers today and I'm standing in my kitchen at 11 o'clock at night and I didn't know who else to call. There was a pause and Emma held her breath, waiting for him to make an excuse, to say he was busy, to remind her that he was just a stranger who'd been kind once, and that didn't mean he'd signed up for this. Instead, he said, Where do you live? What? Your address? What is it? Emma told him, her voice uncertain. There was a rustling sound on his end, like he was getting out of bed, moving around. I'm about 40 minutes from you, Daniel said. Maybe less at this time of night. Are you at home? Yes, but you don't have to. I'm already getting dressed, he said. Put some coffee on if you want, or don't. I'll be there soon. The line went dead. Emma stood in her kitchen, phone still pressed to her ear, trying to process what had just happened. A stranger was driving to her house in the middle of the night because she'd called him in a moment of weakness. This was crazy. This was dangerous. This was the first time in 3 months she'd felt something other than numbness. Daniel showed up with a pizza and an old DVD of Casablanca that he'd grabbed from his apartment on the way over. Emma opened the door at 11:43, still in the same worn pajama pants and oversized t-shirt she'd been wearing for 2 days, her hair pulled back in a messy knot. And he didn't comment on any of it. He just smiled gently and held up the pizza box like an offering. Said something about how nobody should have to face divorce papers on an empty stomach and somehow made it feel like the most natural thing in the world to invite a near stranger into her home in the middle of the night. They didn't talk about Michael. They didn't talk about the airport or the betrayal or the crushing weight of starting over at 40. Instead, they ate pizza on her couch while Humphrey Bogart told Ingrid Bergman they'd always have Paris. And for 2 hours, Emma forgot to feel broken. When Daniel left around 2 in the morning, she walked him to the door and realized she'd smiled more in those few hours than she had in the previous 3 months combined. He started showing up after that. Not every day, never intruding, but enough that Emma began to anticipate the sound of his car in the driveway, the knock on her door that somehow always came when she needed it most. Sometimes he brought breakfast, bagels from the place on 4th Street still warm, with the cream cheese she liked. Sometimes he just appeared with his laptop and worked quietly at her kitchen table while she graded papers, the comfortable silence between them more soothing than any conversation could be. They took walks in Riverside Park on Sunday mornings when his flight schedule allowed. Daniel told her about his job, about the strange intimacy of being responsible for hundreds of lives while suspended 30,000 feet in the air. about how he'd wanted to be a pilot since he was 7 years old and his father took him to an air show. Emma told him about teaching, about how literature had saved her as a teenager, growing up in a house where nobody read anything but bills and grocery lists, about her favorite student who'd just gotten into Berkeley and made her believe that what she did mattered. It was during one of these walks, as they watched ducks glide across the pond, that Daniel told her about Rachel, his ex-fiancée, how they'd been together for 4 years, how he'd proposed on a beach in Hawaii at sunset because that's what you did when you wanted to make a moment perfect, how his best friend Marcus had been his groomsman, had helped him pick out the ring, had thrown him a bachelor party where they'd played poker and talked about the future like it was something solid and knowable. "I came home early from a trip," Daniel said, his voice steady, but his eyes focused on something far away. "I was supposed to be gone for 3 days, but the weather canceled our second leg, so I drove home from the airport. Found them in my bed." In my bed. He laughed, but it was a sound without humor. The cliché of it almost made it worse somehow, like I was living through every bad movie, every cautionary tale. Emma reached for his hand without thinking, and he held it like it was something precious, something that might break if he squeezed too hard. "How long did it take?" she asked. "Before you could breathe again?" "Longer than I wanted it to," he admitted. "But it did happen. One day I woke up and realized I'd gone a whole morning without thinking about it. Then a whole day. Then a week. The pain doesn't disappear, Emma. It just becomes something you carry instead of something that carries you." Summer turned to fall and Emma slowly came back to herself, but a different self, a newer version she was still learning to recognize. She painted her bedroom walls a deep teal blue, a color Michael would have hated, and bought new sheets that smelled like lavender and possibility. She started running in the mornings, her body remembering rhythms it had forgotten, her lungs expanding with air that tasted like freedom. She joined a book club at the local library and rediscovered the pleasure of arguing about character motivation with strangers who became friends. Daniel was there for all of it, but never at the center, never demanding space or attention. He was like a steady presence at the edge of her transformation, someone who witnessed her becoming without trying to shape it. He brought her coffee the morning she threw out all of Michael's remaining things, the random items left behind, an old sweatshirt, a tennis racket, a box of photographs she couldn't bring herself to look through. He sat with her while she went through them, one by one, and when she started to cry, he just handed her tissues and waited until she was ready to keep going. One evening in October, as they sat on her porch watching the leaves fall from the maple tree, Daniel asked her about Rome, whether she still wanted to go, whether the dream had died with the marriage, or if it was something she could reclaim. Emma thought about it, really thought about it, watching the way the setting sun caught the gold and red leaves, making them look like they were on fire. "I think I needed Rome to save my marriage," she said slowly, "but maybe now I need it for something else. Maybe I need it to prove to myself that I can still want things, still dream about things, even after everything." Daniel nodded, didn't push, didn't offer to take her there himself. He just said, "You will. When you're ready, you'll go. And it'll be exactly what you need it to be." Emma looked at him in the fading light, at this man who'd stumbled into her life at her lowest moment and had somehow become essential without ever asking to be, and felt something shift in her chest, something that felt dangerously close to hope. The shift happened gradually, so slowly that Emma almost didn't notice it until the realization hit her like a wave she hadn't seen coming. She was falling in love with Daniel Carter. It was there in the way her heart sped up when she heard his car pull into her driveway, in the way she found herself thinking about him during her lunch breaks at school, in the way his absence felt like a physical thing when his flight schedule took him away for days at a time. She'd catch herself smiling at nothing, remembering something funny he'd said, or checking her phone more often than necessary, hoping for a text. It terrified her. The fear arrived in the middle of the night, sharp and suffocating, pulling her from sleep with her heart racing and her hands cold. She lay in her teal bedroom, staring at shadows on the ceiling, and felt panic crawl up her throat. She'd been here before. She'd felt these feelings before. She'd trusted before, believed before, given her whole heart to someone before, and it had been handed back to her in pieces through a text message in an airport. How could she possibly risk that again? How could she survive it if Daniel turned out to be another Michael, another man who'd smile at her across the breakfast table while planning his exit strategy? The thought made her nauseous, made her want to grab her phone and text him right now. Tell him to stop coming around. Tell him she couldn't do this. Couldn't let him get any closer, because the closer he got, the more devastating it would be when he left, because people left. That's what Emma had learned. They left you at airports. They left you with divorce papers. They left you standing alone in houses that used to be homes, wondering how you'd missed all the signs, all the moments when love had quietly packed its bags and walked out the door. Daniel must have sensed something changing, because he started looking at her differently, his eyes holding questions he didn't ask out loud. They were at her house on a Friday evening in late November, the first real cold snap of the season, making everything feel crisp and sharp-edged. They'd made dinner together, pasta with garlic and olive oil, and afterward they'd settled on the couch with tea. A documentary about Icelandic volcanoes playing on the television that neither of them was really watching. Emma was hyper-aware of every point where their bodies almost touched. His arm along the back of the couch, inches from her shoulder. His knee close enough to hers that she could feel the warmth of him through her jeans. She'd been comfortable with this proximity before, had even welcomed it, but now it felt dangerous, loaded with possibilities that scared her more than they excited her. Daniel turned to her during a commercial break, and something in his expression told Emma he was about to cross a line they'd been carefully dancing around for months. "Emma," he said quietly, and her name in his mouth sounded like a question and an answer at the same time. He leaned toward her, slow enough that she could stop him, his intention clear in every movement. Emma's breath caught. She wanted this. God, she wanted this. But she also wanted to run, to push him away, to protect herself from the inevitable pain that came with letting someone in. For a moment she froze, caught between desire and terror, and then, just as his lips were about to touch hers, she pulled back. "I can't," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm sorry. I can't." Daniel stopped immediately, moving back to give her space, his expression careful and controlled. "Okay," he said simply. "That's okay. It's not that I don't want to," Emma said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "It's that I want to too much. And that scares me. You scare me. Not because of anything you've done, but because of what I feel when I'm with you. And I don't know if I can trust that. I don't know if I can trust myself to know the difference between real and pretend, between love and just desperately not wanting to be alone." Daniel listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he didn't try to convince her she was wrong or reassure her with empty promises. He just reached out and took her hand, holding it gently. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "Not because I'm waiting for you to change your mind or because I think I can convince you, but because you're my friend, Emma. Before anything else, you're my friend, and that matters to me." "What if I'm never ready?" she asked, hating how small her voice sounded. "What if I'm too broken? What if Michael took something from me that I can't get back? Then we'll figure that out when we get there," Daniel said. "But I don't think you're broken. I think you're healing. And healing takes the time it takes. There's no schedule, no deadline. I'm not in a hurry." He left shortly after that, and Emma stood at her door watching his taillights disappear down the street. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass and cried. But these tears felt different from the ones she'd shed in the airport, in her kitchen, in her bed during those first awful months. These tears weren't about loss. They were about the terrifying, exhilarating possibility that maybe, just maybe, she might get a second chance at happiness if she could find the courage to reach for it. Spring arrived with an urgency that felt almost aggressive, as if nature itself was insisting that Emma stop hiding and step back into the world. The cherry blossoms in Riverside Park exploded into pink clouds that lasted barely a week before scattering across the sidewalks like confetti from a wedding she wasn't invited to. Emma had been teaching for a full year since the airport, had signed final divorce papers 6 months ago, had moved into a smaller house on the east side of town where every room was hers and hers alone. Daniel was still there, still present, still patient in a way that made Emma wonder what she'd done to deserve this kind of steadfast friendship. They'd settled into something comfortable and undefined. He came over for dinner on Wednesdays. They went to movies on Friday nights when he wasn't flying. They texted throughout the day, small observations and bad jokes and photos of interesting clouds. But they hadn't talked about that almost kiss since November. Daniel had kept his word, had given her space without disappearing, had somehow managed to remain close without pressing for more. Emma had started to believe this was enough. That maybe romantic love wasn't something she needed. That friendship and companionship could fill the spaces in her life that used to ache with loneliness. She'd convinced herself she was content, that she'd grown past the need for that kind of vulnerability. And then Daniel showed up on a Tuesday afternoon in April with an envelope in his hand and a nervous energy she'd never seen in him before. She was grading papers at her kitchen table, red pen in hand, when she heard his knock. It was earlier than usual, barely 3 o'clock, and he should have been on a flight to Chicago according to the schedule he'd mentioned that morning. Emma opened the door to find him standing there in jeans and a gray sweater, his hair slightly disheveled, holding a cream-colored envelope like it might explode. "I did something," he said without preamble, "and you're probably going to think I'm crazy, and you can absolutely say no, but I need to show you this before I lose my nerve." Emma stepped back to let him in, her curiosity overriding her caution. Daniel walked to her kitchen table, set the envelope down carefully, and then stepped back, running his hand through his hair in a gesture she recognized as nervousness. "Open it," he said. Inside were 2 plane tickets. Emma pulled them out slowly, her heart beginning to race as she read the destination. Rome. Departing in 3 weeks. Returning 10 days later. Her name was on one ticket. His name was on the other. "I know this is a lot," Daniel said quickly, his words coming out in a rush. "And I know Rome is complicated for you, that it's tied up with everything that happened with Michael. But I've been thinking about what you said last fall, about how you needed it for something different now, and I thought maybe we could go together. Not as a couple, not with any expectations or pressure, but just as 2 people who want to see the Colosseum and eat too much gelato and throw coins in fountains. You can have your own room. We can spend the whole trip apart if that's what you need. But Emma, you deserve to have Rome. You deserve to have all the things that were taken from you, and maybe I can't give them back, but I can at least give you this." Emma stared at the tickets, her vision blurring. The dates were almost exactly 1 year after the original trip she'd planned with Michael. The flight left from the same airport where he'd abandoned her. She should feel triggered by this, should feel the panic rising, should want to push these tickets back across the table and tell Daniel he'd overstepped, that he'd crossed a line they'd carefully maintained. But instead, she felt something else, something that felt like a door opening, like permission to reclaim something that had been stolen. "I'm terrified," she admitted, looking up at him. "I'm terrified of that airport. I'm terrified of getting on a plane with someone and having it all go wrong. I'm terrified of wanting something this much because the last time I wanted something this much, it destroyed me." "I know," Daniel said softly, "and if you say no, I'll understand. I'll return the tickets and we'll never mention it again. But Emma, I'm also terrified. I'm terrified of loving someone who can't love me back. I'm terrified that I've been waiting for a year for you to be ready, and maybe you'll never be ready. I'm terrified that I'm about to lose the best friend I've ever had because I couldn't keep my feelings to myself. But I'd rather be terrified with you than safe and alone." The words hung in the air between them. Emma looked at the tickets, then at Daniel, then back at the tickets. Rome. The city she'd dreamed about for so long it had started to feel like a myth, a place that existed only in her imagination. She thought about the woman she'd been a year ago, standing in that airport with her pink suitcase and her foolish hope. She thought about the woman she was now, scarred but stronger, broken but healing. "Okay," she heard herself say. "Let's go to Rome." Portland International Airport looked exactly the same. Same tall windows letting in morning light. Same smell of coffee and cleaning solution. Same crowds of people pulling suitcases and checking tickets and saying goodbye to people they loved. Emma stood at the entrance with Daniel beside her and her new blue suitcase at her feet. And for a moment, she couldn't move. Her body remembered this place. Remembered standing here a year ago with Michael. Remembered the hope and the betrayal and the crushing weight of abandonment that had started right here on this exact floor. Daniel must have sensed her freezing because he reached for her hand, and the warmth of his palm against hers brought her back to the present moment. "We can leave," he said quietly. "Right now. We can get back in the car and pretend this never happened. No judgment, no questions. Whatever you need." Emma took a breath, then another. She looked at Daniel, really looked at him, at this man who'd found her at her lowest and had somehow decided she was worth staying for, who'd waited patiently while she rebuilt herself, who'd bought tickets to Rome not knowing if she'd say yes, risking rejection because he believed she deserved to reclaim her dreams. "No," she said, squeezing his hand. "I want to do this. I want to do this with you." They checked in together, went through security side by side, found their gate without incident. Emma half expected Michael to appear around every corner, half expected some catastrophe to prevent them from boarding. But nothing happened. Just a normal morning at an airport, just two people waiting for a flight that would take them somewhere new. When they called their boarding group, Daniel stood and offered Emma his arm. She took it, and together they walked down the jetway, onto the plane, found their seats by the window. As the plane taxied toward the runway, Emma looked out at the city disappearing beneath them and felt something release in her chest. She was leaving. She was really leaving. And this time, she wasn't being left behind. Rome was everything she'd imagined and nothing like she'd expected. They spent their days wandering through ruins and museums, eating pasta in tiny restaurants where the waiter called them innamorati, even though they insisted they were just friends. They threw coins in the Trevi fountain at sunset, standing shoulder to shoulder among hundreds of tourists, and Emma closed her eyes and made a wish she didn't speak aloud. On their 6th day, they found themselves back at the fountain in the early morning before the crowds arrived. The water caught the golden light, and Emma thought about how far she'd traveled to get here. Not just the miles from Oregon, but the internal distance she'd covered, from devastation to this moment of peace. Daniel turned to her, and there was something in his expression that made Emma's breath catch. He didn't get down on one knee. He didn't pull out a ring. He just stood there in the Roman morning and said, "I need to tell you something, and you don't have to respond. You don't have to say anything back, but I can't keep carrying this without you knowing. I love you, Emma, not in a waiting for you to love me back way, not in an expectation way. I just love you. I love how you underline passages in books and leave them around the house. I love how you cry during commercials. I love how you fought your way back from something that would have destroyed most people. And I don't know what the future looks like, but I know I want to spend it with you, in whatever form you'll let me." Emma felt tears sliding down her cheeks, but this time they weren't tears of pain. They were something else entirely, something that felt like release, like permission, like finally allowing herself to believe that maybe the end of one story could be the beginning of another. "I love you too," she whispered. "I think I have for a long time. I was just too scared to admit it." Daniel smiled, that slow, gentle smile she'd come to know so well, and pulled her close. They stood there by the fountain as the sun rose higher, two people who'd been broken by betrayal and had somehow found each other in the wreckage, and Emma understood with sudden clarity that this was what love was supposed to feel like. Not desperate, not terrifying, just steady and sure and real. She thought about the woman she'd been, standing alone in an airport with a pink suitcase and a shattered heart. She thought about all the nights she'd spent wondering if she'd ever feel whole again, if she'd ever trust again, if she'd ever want to open herself up to the possibility of love after everything she'd lost. And here, in Rome, in the city she'd dreamed of visiting with the wrong person, Emma finally understood that sometimes being left behind is the universe's brutal way of pushing you toward where you're actually supposed to be. That sometimes the worst thing that ever happens to you is also the thing that saves your life. If this story touched something in you, if you believe that endings can become beginnings, subscribe to this channel. Every week we share real stories of women who transformed their pain into power, who learned that being broken doesn't mean being destroyed, because you're not alone in this journey. None of us are.